Over 2 decades, Europeans were asked about their own economic situation. For the upcoming year, most Europeans thought the situation was going to get better, but their country as a whole was heading in a downward trajectory. From 1992 to 2015, most Americans thought that crime in their country had been increasing year on year, where in reality, the crime rate had been plummeting during those time periods. And since the 1970s, most Americans thought that their country was heading in the wrong direction. But what probably creates the largest chasm in the optimism gap is our bias towards bad being stronger than good. Psychologist Amos Tversky tried to answer this point in a question he once asked. How much better could you feel than you are feeling right now? And how much worse off can you imagine yourself feeling? For the first question, most people could say maybe a slightly rosier disposition, perhaps a lucky financial break. But for the second question, there's almost a bottomless pit of misery that people can imagine. Another way of looking at it is how many things could happen that would leave you with a feeling that you're better off. Maybe you get a nice email from someone, a friend rings you up that you haven't talked to for a long time. But on the opposite, how many things that could make you feel worse off? You could get a phone call about a relative dying. You could get into a car crash on your way to work. So the difference is the dichotomy between the two is leaning much towards the negative. And the psychological literature confirms that we dwell on setbacks more so than our good fortune. So why do so many people harp on about the good old days? Well, the exception to the negativity bias is people's autobiographical memory. The negative colouring of our misfortune fades with age. We are wired for nostalgia. We misattribute the growing burdens and responsibilities of adulthood to a less innocent world. We connect our ever-frailing faculties to a decline in the times. Or as Franklin Adams would put it, nothing is more responsible for the good old days than a bad memory. This propensity for bad being stronger than good can be found in our brain's adaptive bias. This cognitive bias may have been a mechanism that has evolved to help reduce the cost of a cognitive error, rather than the number of errors we make when facing a decision of uncertainty. An example of this is, say you're walking home at night. You'll probably take a suboptimal path to avoid strangers, even though 99.9% of strangers are probably perfectly fine people, or at least wouldn't hurt you. This is because you might run into that 0.01% of people that are deranged, malevolent people that could either cause injury or even death by just merely walking past them. This has, to a large degree, skewed our idea of pessimists and optimists. Experiments have shown that if a critic pans a book, he is perceived as more competent than one who has praised it. This also might be true in other areas of society. Or as musician Tim Lehrer proclaimed, always predict the worst and you'll be hailed as a prophet. So journalists are incentivized to accentuate the negative aspects of a story, to fulfill their moral duty as watchdogs or whistleblowers. There's huge professional benefit for uncovering a story of a sick society, even if you kind of had to contrive or twist the story. This is because pessimists sound like they're trying to give you a warning for some evil that is to come, whereas an optimist just sounds like they're just trying to sell you something, like a used car salesman. If an optimist offers a solution, there'll be a cavalcade of detractors saying that it's not the perfect panacea for the solution. Since every idea has unintended consequences and side effects, the pessimist here will be partially validated. But the pessimists might miss the point that this is perhaps just the first iteration of a full solution. After the 2016 US election, New York Times reporters David Bornstein and Tina Rosenberg wrote in a column, "For decades, journalism's steady focus on problems and seemingly incurable pathologies was preparing the soil that allowed Trump's seeds of discontent and despair to take root. One consequence is that many Americans today have difficulty imagining, valuing, or even believing in the promise of incremental system change, which led for a greater appetite for a revolutionary smash-the-machine change." So how can we measure progress then? Well, it's fairly easy to get started, and I'll quote here directly from Steven Pinker. "Most people agree that life is better than death. Health is better than sickness. Sustenance is better than hunger. Abundance is better than poverty. Peace is better than war. Safety is better than danger. Freedom is better than tyranny. Equality rights are better than bigotry and discrimination. Literacy is better than illiteracy. Knowledge is better than ignorance. Intelligence is better than dull-wittedness. Happiness is better than misery. Opportunities to enjoy families, friends, culture, and nature are better than drudgery and monotony. All these things can be measured. If they have increased over time, that is progress. As you can see, the lighting has changed quite a bit over this episode because I suck at speaking to camera and it takes me forever to film these. Well, all of what I've just said mostly is just the preamble to make you aware of some of the cognitive biases that permeate through society. In future episodes, I'm going to analyse how the human condition has changed. And if you haven't caught the drift yet, human well-being has increased around the world quite dramatically in some instances. So before you just roll your eyes and go back to your dystopian propaganda, my next episode is going to be about the major challenges that we are facing in the 21st century. The challenges of the 21st century are extremely consequential because if we don't ameliorate them soon, it's the world's poorest that will be the most affected. They'll slip back into extreme poverty, pointless drudgery, and a sense of absolute hopelessness, the likes of which have been seen before in previous centuries. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing, and if you want to get notified, tap the bell button as well.